Imagine solving math problems while half asleep. Not with a calculator, not with a chalkboard, but with nothing but your dreams. Imagine seeing formulas float in front of your eyes the way most people see sheep when they're trying to fall asleep. That was the strange and unbelievable life of Srinivasa Ramanujan, the man who dreamed numbers, the man who gave the world mathematics that still leaves experts shaking their heads and muttering, how on earth did he do that? Ramanujan's story doesn't begin in some grand university library or in a lab filled with white-coated professors. No, his story starts in a small town in southern India at the end of the 19th century. He was born in 1887 in the town of Erode in Tamil Nadu, not exactly the kind of place you'd expect to produce a mind that would one day shake the very foundations of mathematics. If you had walked through that town back then, you'd have seen dusty streets, temples, busy markets, the smell of spice in the air. What you would not have seen was a young boy destined to become one of the most mysterious geniuses in history. And the crazy part, nobody saw it coming. Ramanujan wasn't born into a family of scholars. His dad worked in a cloth shop. His mum was a deeply religious woman who sang in a temple. They were poor, not Netflix subscription instead of Spotify subscription. Poor. We're talking eat today, maybe not tomorrow, poor. So when I say that nobody expected greatness from young Ramanujan, I really mean it. He was supposed to grow up, get a modest job, live a modest life, and that would be it. But life had other plans. Somewhere along the way, this kid picked up numbers and just refused to let go. It's almost like numbers chose him. Some people collect stamps, some people collect Pokemon cards. Ramanujan collected theorems. By the time he was a teenager, he was filling notebooks with formulas that looked like they came from another planet. Now, before we go too deep, let's take a step back, because you might be wondering, why is this guy such a big deal? I mean, we've had other famous mathematicians, right? We've got Newton dropping apples, we've got Einstein sticking his tongue out in photographs, we've got Pythagoras making triangles cool. So what makes Ramanujan different? Here's the thing, most mathematicians build on what came before. They spend years studying, reading, learning the rules, and then they slowly, carefully add a little brick to the giant wall of knowledge. Ramanujan didn't do that. He just showed up one day with a whole new wall, actually several new walls, with secret doors, spiral staircases, and windows looking into dimensions nobody even knew existed. And when people asked him, how did you figure this out? His answer was basically, oh, the goddess told me in a dream. Not exactly the typical academic citation. Ramanujan's brain worked in ways that seemed supernatural. He could see connections between numbers that took everyone else decades to even notice. He wrote down results without proofs, just these breathtaking formulas, and they almost always turned out to be correct. Imagine if someone handed you a cheat sheet with answers to questions you didn't even know were going to be on the test. That was Ramanujan's entire career. But genius alone isn't enough. History is full of forgotten geniuses. What makes Ramanujan's story so fascinating is the journey. Because here's this poor kid in India. No formal training, no access to big libraries, no internet, no TikTok tutorials, nothing. And yet somehow he reaches across continents, across cultures, and connects with one of the greatest mathematicians in England, G.H. Hardy. Together they create one of the most unlikely partnerships in the history of science. And the work that comes out of it still blows minds today. But we'll get to Hardy later. Right now, picture Ramanujan as a boy. He's sickly, skinny, living in a world where education isn't guaranteed. He has to borrow books just to keep learning. And then he stumbles across a math book so thick and so packed with results that it basically becomes his Bible. He copies formulas, experiments, makes notes. He doesn't just study math. He breathes it, dreams it, lives it. While other kids are out playing games, Ramanujan is scribbling down identities and series expansions that most PhD students can't even read without crying. And while all of this is fascinating, it's also funny in a way. Because imagine being his teacher. You're trying to explain fractions to the class. And meanwhile, this one weird kid is quietly working on problems that don't even exist in your syllabus. You'd probably just shake your head and think, well, that's going to be someone else's problem. Ramanujan was not a prodigy in the traditional sense. He wasn't like those kids who can recite pi to 10,000 digits to impress their relatives at dinner. He wasn't about memorizing, he was about creating. His mind generated new mathematics the way an artist paints or a musician composes. And that's what makes him different from almost everyone else in history. His work didn't look like it came from a textbook. It looked like it came from somewhere far stranger, somewhere closer to dreams. That's why people call him the man who dreamed numbers, because he really did claim that the goddess Numagiri would come to him in visions, writing equations across the walls of his mind. And sure, maybe that sounds a bit too mystical for some people, but here's the catch. The math worked. You can't just dream up nonsense and have it survive 100 years of scrutiny, unless of course your dreams are better than most people's waking hours. As we dive deeper into his life, you'll see how improbable this all was, how many obstacles stood in his way. Poverty, lack of education, illness, cultural barriers, any one of those could have crushed his potential, but somehow he pushed through. And the result is one of the most incredible stories in mathematics, maybe in all of science. So as we open this curtain on Ramanujan's life, think of it as more than a biography. It's a mystery. How does genius appear when nobody expects it? How does a poor boy in a small town in India come to change the way the world thinks about numbers? And most of all, what does it mean that his greatest discoveries came not from years of training, but from dreams? That's the story we're about to explore. A story of obsession, struggle, friendship, and brilliance. A story filled with strange equations, divine inspiration, and one very famous taxicab number. A story that will take us from the quiet streets of Kumbakonam to the halls of Cambridge University, and finally, back again. And through it all, we'll try to understand the mind of the man who dreamed numbers. If you went back in time to the town of Kumbakonam in the late 1800s, you would not have guessed that the dusty little streets were hiding a world-class genius. You'd probably see merchants haggling over spices, kids running around barefoot, cows just casually blocking traffic as they still do today, and temple bells ringing in the distance. What you would not see is a math prodigy with a destiny. You'd see a skinny little boy, shy, often sick, sitting in the corner with a piece of chalk, scribbling something that looked like absolute nonsense to everyone else. That boy was Ramanujan. Ramanujan grew up in a tiny house with tiled roof and cracked walls. If you picture a genius's childhood, you might imagine shelves of books, educated parents, maybe a grandfather who's a professor. Not here. His father was a clerk in a cloth shop. His mother was deeply religious, more worried about prayers and rituals than about multiplication tables. The family didn't have money for luxuries, and in that world, higher education was almost a dream too big to dream. But here's the thing, genius doesn't care about background. Genius doesn't knock politely and ask if your family can afford private tutors. It just shows up uninvited, like that one neighbour who always borrows your lawnmower. And for Ramanujan, genius arrived in the form of numbers. He saw numbers everywhere, in patterns on temple carvings, in the rhythms of chants, in the way the world seemed to organise itself. While other kids might doodle animals or flowers in the margins of their notebooks, Ramanujan doodled equations, which, to be fair, is probably why he didn't have that many friends at first. School was complicated. On the one hand, Ramanujan was brilliant. On the other, he wasn't exactly a model student. He would ace mathematics like it was the easiest thing in the world, but completely ignore other subjects. English? Forget it. History? Meh. Geography? Unless the rivers added up to a nice formula, not interested. Teachers didn't know what to do with him. It's not that he was lazy, he just didn't see the point. Why memorize kings and battles when you could spend that time trying to figure out infinite series? And yet, despite his strange habits, teachers noticed something unusual. Ramanujan didn't just solve problems, he created them. Give him a problem and he wouldn't stop at the solution. He'd invent new formulas, new patterns, new ways of thinking. It's like asking a kid to build a Lego house and coming back to find they've built an entire Lego city, complete with plumbing and traffic regulations. But life was not all chalkboards and daydreams. His family was poor, and poor in late 19th century India meant real struggles. He often didn't have proper food. He often fell sick. He didn't have the luxury of just sitting around and being a genius. And yet he kept filling notebooks with equations. Nobody around him could even understand what he was doing. To most people, his notebooks looked like the ramblings of a bored teenager, but inside those scribbles were glimpses of brilliance that would change the course of mathematics. One of my favourite images is little Ramanujan, barefoot, carrying a notebook almost as big as his body. scribbling as he walked. He didn't treat mathematics as homework. He treated it like a diary. Some people write down their feelings. Ramanujan wrote down the secrets of numbers, and in some ways that notebook became his best friend. You can almost imagine him whispering, "Don't worry, little notebook. One day someone will understand you." Spoiler alert, it took a while. His mother noticed his obsession, of course. She thought it was strange but also divine. She believed he was chosen by the goddess Namagiri, who would appear in dreams and guide him. So while other kids' mums nagged them to put away the books and go outside, Ramanujan's mum probably just shook her head and said, "Well, if the goddess wants him to keep scribbling, who am I to argue?" The truth is, his obsession often got him in trouble. He was so focused on math that he flunked other subjects. In a system that required passing all subjects to move forward, this was a disaster. Imagine failing exams not because you're dumb, but because you're too smart in the wrong category. His classmates probably thought he was a bit of a weirdo. While they studied practical things, he was busy asking questions nobody could even understand. Questions like, what happens when numbers go on forever? Or can infinity have different sizes? Try dropping that into a playground conversation and see how many friends you make. But every hero's journey starts with being misunderstood. And in Ramanujan's case, misunderstanding came with a healthy dose of poverty and struggle. Yet somehow the boy and his notebook kept going. He would later fill multiple notebooks with formulas, thousands of them, many still being studied today. And it all started in that little town, with a little boy and a notebook nobody else cared about. There's something beautiful about that. Think about it. The greatest mathematical treasures of the 20th century weren't discovered in a lab with expensive equipment. They were scribbled in pencil by a poor kid in South India. Proof that brilliance doesn't need a fancy setting. It just needs obsession, curiosity, and maybe a goddess whispering in your dreams. And here's where the humour sneaks in. Because imagine being one of his teachers. You assign a simple geometry problem. Find the area of this triangle. Next day, Ramanujan hands you 3 pages of formulas about infinite series, modular functions, and maybe even a new way to calculate pi. As a teacher, do you give him an A? Do you fail him for not following instructions? Or do you just sigh and hope someone else deals with this kid? Honestly, I'd probably just retire early. But let's be fair. At this stage, nobody could see what was coming. To the villagers, he was just a sickly, obsessed boy. To his teachers, he was a headache. To his family, he was a bit of a mystery. Only history would reveal the truth, that those notebooks were not the scribbles of a confused child, but the opening chapters of a genius who would one day stand alongside the greatest minds in the world. So picture it again. A dusty village, a skinny boy, a notebook filled with strange symbols. Nothing glamorous, nothing that screams destiny. And yet, that's exactly where the story of the man who dreamed numbers truly begins. Because in that notebook, scribbled by candlelight, lay equations that would one day travel across oceans, cross cultural boundaries, and challenge the brightest mathematicians of the modern age. Every obsession has its trigger. For Sherlock Holmes, it was mysteries. For Marie Curie, it was glowing chemicals. For that one guy you know who won't stop talking about Bitcoin, it was probably a YouTube video at 2 a.m. For Ramanujan, the trigger came in the form of a book. And not just any book, but a book that looked at first glance about as exciting as a phone directory. It was called A Synopsis of Elementary Results in Pure Mathematics by George Shoebridge Carr. The name alone could make you yawn hard enough to pull a muscle. But for Ramanujan, this dry, technical book was like discovering a chest of pirate treasure. It was published in the 19th century as a reference for students. It wasn't a textbook in the normal sense. It didn't explain things step by step. It was basically a giant list of about 5,000 theorems and formulas. No proofs, no explanations, just result after result. Imagine buying a cookbook where all it says is cake exists, soup exists, pasta exists, and then just leaves you to figure out the recipes. Most people would flip through this and think, well, that's useless. But Ramanujan saw it as a challenge, like the goddess Namagiri herself had dropped a puzzle book straight into his lap. And here's the twist. He didn't just read the theorems, he started proving them on his own, extending them, reshaping them, and in some cases creating entirely new ones. Think about what that means. He didn't have teachers to guide him, he didn't have math journals to compare notes with, he didn't even have access to much paper. He often had to write in the margins of old scrap or on slate, and yet he started turning this skeletal book into living mathematics. What for most students would have been a wall of intimidation for him became a doorway to imagination. His obsession deepened quickly. He filled notebook after notebook with formulas, thousands of results, many of which were completely original. These notebooks became legendary later on. Mathematicians would study them for decades, trying to piece together what Ramanujan had been doing alone in his room as a teenager. Imagine discovering the sketchbook of an unknown artist, only to realize the doodles inside are masterpieces no one had ever seen before. That was Ramanujan's math. Of course, this obsession came at a price. School wanted him to pass exams. Ramanujan wanted to calculate infinite series until his chalk broke. Guess which one he chose? Spoiler alert, not the exams. He repeatedly failed subjects that weren't math. English dragged him down, science too, and in the rigid system of colonial India, if you failed non-math subjects, you failed everything. End of story. He lost his scholarship. And once you lose your scholarship in a poor family, your life path usually shrinks to something like get a job, earn just enough to survive, and quietly forget your dreams. But Ramanujan didn't forget. He couldn't. He wasn't wired for normal. He was wired for obsession. Day and night he scribbled, sometimes on borrowed notebooks, sometimes on discarded bits of paper, sometimes even on his own body, when nothing else was available. It's not that he thought he was making history, he just couldn't stop. Like an artist who has to paint, or a musician who has to play, Ramanujan had to write down numbers. There's a funny image here too. Picture him sitting at a desk, broke, sickly, hungry, and instead of looking for a job, he's busy writing some formula about infinite series that nobody else in the room can understand. His family must have thought, what are we going to do with this boy? Because obsession doesn't always look like genius at first. It usually looks like madness. And honestly, from the outside it was a little mad. He wasn't writing neat theorems with clean explanations. He was jotting down raw results, sometimes without proof, sometimes without context. To another person, his notes looked like a storm of numbers and symbols, but hidden inside that storm were breathtaking insights. Take, for example, his work on partitions. The number of ways you can break down an integer into sums. Like, how many ways can you write the number 4 as a sum? Easy. 4, 3 plus 1, 2 plus 2, 2 plus 1, 1, 1 plus 1, 1, 1. That's 5 ways. Seems simple, right? But Ramanujan found deep patterns in these partitions, patterns nobody else had seen. Later, his results would help launch entirely new branches of number theory. But at the time, they were just lines in his secret notebooks. And it wasn't just partitions. He started writing formulas for pi that were so shockingly efficient that a century later, computers used them to calculate billions of digits. He wrote identities involving infinite series that left professionals scratching their heads. He wrote things that didn't even make sense until string theory physicists stumbled on them decades later and went, wait, this looks familiar. But none of that glory had arrived yet. At this stage, he was just a poor kid with notebooks full of scribbles, failing exams, disappointing teachers, worrying his family, and slowly, quietly laying the foundation for greatness. There's an almost tragic comedy in it. Imagine being his classmate. You're stressing about memorizing geography rivers, while the weird kid next to you is writing down formulas that will one day be used in cutting-edge physics. At the time, nobody would have traded places with him. Looking back, we can't believe anyone else mattered in that classroom. Ramanujan's obsession made him an outsider, but it also became his fuel. Without Khan's synopsis, maybe he would never have gone so deep. Maybe he would have been just another kid who liked math. But that book gave him a taste of infinity, and once he had that taste, he couldn't let it go. So picture him again, sitting at a small wooden desk, candle flickering, scribbling formula after formula while the rest of the world sleeps. In his head, the goddess whispers. In his notebook, universes unfold. To his family, he looks like a hopeless dreamer. To his teachers, he looks like a lost cause. But history will remember him as the boy whose obsession with one book launched a lifetime of brilliance. This is where his legend begins. Not in Cambridge, not in the letters to Hardy, not in the halls of fame, but here, in a small town with a dusty book, a flickering candle, and a boy who couldn't stop writing numbers. At this point in Ramanujan's life, something truly strange began to happen. Strange enough that even in the world of eccentric geniuses, it stands out. He started claiming that many of his mathematical ideas didn't come from books or from hours of grinding through problems. They came to him in dreams. Now, most of us dream about weird things, like you're running late to class and suddenly you're also riding a giraffe, and your math teacher is a giant slice of pizza. That's a normal dream. Ramanujan's dreams were different. He dreamed of numbers, he dreamed of equations, he saw symbols written on temple walls in his sleep, and not just random squiggles, formulas that turned out to be real, meaningful, and sometimes groundbreaking mathematics. He believed these visions came from the goddess Namagiri, the family deity his mother worshipped. In his mind, the goddess wasn't just a comforting presence. She was an active collaborator, delivering entire theorems like divine text messages straight into his brain. Imagine waking up and saying, "Well, I had a dream last night. The goddess gave me 3 theorems and a new recipe for calculating pi." That was Ramanujan's reality. To be fair, he wasn't the only person in history to get big ideas in dreams. August Kekulé, the German chemist, once dreamed of a snake biting its own tail, and that inspired him to figure out the ring structure of benzene, which became a cornerstone of organic chemistry. Paul McCartney literally dreamed the melody for Yesterday. The Russian scientist Dmitry Mendeleev, he said he dreamed the entire periodic table of elements. So dreaming up world-changing stuff isn't unique. But Ramanujan took it to another level. His entire mathematical process seemed dream-fueled. Here's the funny part. Most of us wake up from a dream, think, wow, that was weird, and then forget it by breakfast. Ramanujan woke up, grabbed a notebook and scribbled down equations that would later shape number theory. Imagine how frustrating that would be if you were his roommate. You're half asleep trying to rest, and suddenly he's lighting a candle at 3 a.m, mumbling about infinite series, and the math wasn't gibberish. That's the truly wild part. You might think, okay, he dreamed formulas, but surely they were just nonsense. No, they worked. Not all of them were complete or fully proved, but the underlying insights were real. Later, when other mathematicians studied his notebooks, they were stunned. It wasn't like he wrote down random numbers. These were deep results, often decades ahead of their time. This raises a fascinating question. Was it really the goddess? Or was Ramanujan's subconscious just working overtime, connecting patterns while he slept? Neuroscience today tells us that dreams can be a place where the brain reorganizes information, mixing and matching ideas in new ways. So maybe Ramanujan's brain, overloaded with math, just kept processing even while he was asleep. Still, most people don't wake up with accurate formulas for calculating pi. That's not normal, even for geniuses. Ramanujan himself never doubted the divine explanation. He truly believed the goddess was guiding him. In his cultural and religious context, that made perfect sense. And maybe that belief was part of what kept him going. When everyone else doubted him, his teachers, his examiners, even his neighbors, he had this unshakable sense that he was chosen for something bigger. That's powerful fuel for an underdog. But let's not skip past the comedy here. Picture it. A teenage Ramanujan explaining to a baffled classmate, "Yeah, the goddess told me this identity for infinite series last night." The classmate, meanwhile, is just trying to memorize multiplication tables and wondering if this guy is okay. If it happened today, people might accuse him of being one of those kids who pretends to channel aliens on TikTok. But unlike TikTok kids, his stuff actually checked out. There's also something poetic about it. Mathematics is often seen as this cold, logical, dry subject. Endless proofs and calculations, the opposite of mystical. But here was Ramanujan, treating math as if it were a sacred language spoken by gods. He blurred the line between logic and faith, between calculation and revelation. It's part of why his story resonates so much. He made math feel alive, even magical. And think about the courage it takes to trust those dreams. If you woke up with some bizarre scribble in your head, you'd probably ignore it. He didn't. He filled notebooks with them. He trusted them so much that he built his entire mathematical career on what most people would dismiss as sleep-induced hallucinations, and history proved him right. Some of the results that came from these dream sessions are jaw-dropping. His work on modular forms, for example, later connected to areas of physics that didn't even exist yet. His infinite series for pi are so efficient that even in the 21st century, computers still rely on them. And his mysterious formulas about partition numbers opened entire new chapters of math. All of that rooted in visions that came in the quiet of the night. Now skeptics will say, hold on, he didn't literally dream the formulas, he must have been working on them while awake, and then his brain processed them in sleep. And maybe that's true, but even if that's the case, it's still incredible. Most people's brains process reality TV in their sleep, not cutting-edge number theory. Ramanujan didn't just dream about numbers, he dreamed about infinity, about the patterns behind reality itself, and then he wrote them down. That's the difference. We all dream, but very few of us have the discipline or the brilliance to capture those fleeting images and turn them into something lasting. So in this chapter of his life, Ramanujan stopped being just a boy with a notebook and started becoming something stranger, a vessel for ideas that seemed to come from beyond ordinary thought. He was already isolated, already misunderstood, already obsessed. Now he added another layer, mysticism. To his neighbours he must have seemed otherworldly. To us, looking back, he seems almost mythical. But here's the best part. You don't need to believe in goddesses to be amazed. Whether you think his dreams were divine or just subconscious creativity, the results are the same. Mathematics poured out of him in a way that defies explanation. And it all happened in the stillness of night, when most people were just snoring. So next time you wake up from a dream about showing up to school without pants, just remember, Ramanujan woke up from his dreams with equations that still blow the minds of mathematicians today. Some people dream in nonsense. Ramanujan dreamed in mathematics. And that, more than anything, is what makes him the man who truly dreamed numbers. Picture this. You're a teenager obsessed with math. You've discovered a book full of theorems, you've been scribbling down thousands of formulas, and you're so deep in your obsession that schoolwork has collapsed around you like a badly built sandcastle. That was Ramanujan. By the time he was in his late teens, he was already operating in a world of his own. A world of numbers, infinite series, and strange identities that no one else around him could understand. And here's the catch. He was completely alone. No teachers guiding him. No classmates helping him. No math club. No internet forum. No friendly mentor. Just him, a notebook, and an endless sea of numbers. It's like deciding to learn every language on earth, but refusing to buy a dictionary. Madness to most people. But for Ramanujan, it was daily life. It wasn't that he didn't try. He actually did go to college. But remember, the education system wanted him to pass English, history, and other subjects. Ramanujan wasn't interested. He only cared about math. And not normal math either, the kind on exams. He wanted the wild stuff, infinite series, elliptic functions, modular equations, things that even professional mathematicians found difficult. So naturally, he failed, again and again, and each failure pushed him further away from formal education. By his early 20s, Ramanujan was basically a dropout with no degree. He had piles of notebooks full of strange results, but no way to explain them, no credibility, no job prospects. His family was worried. His neighbours probably thought he was lazy or eccentric. And society? Society tends to ignore people who don't fit the mould, especially poor people in colonial India. This is the part of the story that feels almost tragic. Imagine having the mind of a genius but none of the tools to share it. Imagine knowing secrets about numbers that no one else knows, but not having the language or the platform to convince anyone. It's like being a singer with the voice of an angel, but the only audience you have is your bathroom mirror. Yet, despite the loneliness, Ramanujan kept going. He didn't slow down. He didn't stop scribbling. His passion burned so brightly that even the lack of recognition couldn't extinguish it. In fact, maybe the isolation made him even more original, because he wasn't following academic traditions. He wasn't reading the latest papers. He wasn't imitating anyone. He was creating math straight from his own mind, unfiltered. There's a kind of raw beauty in that. Most mathematicians are shaped by the conversations and debates of their time. Ramanujan wasn't. He was shaped by silence, by solitude, by the whispers of his dreams. His math wasn't polished by peer review. It was carved out of thin air. Sometimes rough, sometimes strange, sometimes incomplete, but always dazzling. Of course, living like this wasn't easy. He needed money. He needed to survive. so he tried to get jobs. He worked briefly as a clerk, crunching numbers in ledgers by day while scribbling genius equations by night. And here's the funny part. Even in those boring clerical jobs, people noticed he was different. Imagine asking a co-worker to calculate some totals, and instead of neat sums, they start explaining an infinite series expansion. That was Ramanujan. Probably not the guy you want balancing the company's accounts. But he didn't give up. He started seeking recognition. He showed his notebooks to professors in India, hoping someone would understand. Most didn't. Some thought he was just another crank, like the math version of those people who mail perpetual motion machine designs to universities. Others admitted he was brilliant but couldn't quite grasp what he was doing. After all, his work had almost no proofs, just raw formulas. In the strict academic world, that was suspicious. And yet every so often he would find someone who saw the spark. One local mathematician, Vikramarishav, recalled meeting him and being blown away. He said Ramanujan's mind was extraordinary and profound. Another, Narayana Iyengar, helped publish a short paper of his in the Journal of the Indian Mathematical Society. It wasn't enough to launch him into fame, but it was a start. Still, he remained on the outside. No degree, no stable career, just a young man with tuberculosis nibbling at his health, poverty nibbling at his future, and notebooks filled with mysteries no one else could solve. That's why this chapter feels like the dark night of his journey. He was stuck between brilliance and obscurity, and nobody knew which way his story would go. Now, let's pause and add a little humour here. Because imagine you're his mum. You've got this son who refuses to hold a proper job, fails his exams, and spends all his time scribbling symbols you can't read. In most families, that kid gets a long lecture about responsibility and maybe a part-time gig sweeping floors. In Ramanujan's family, his mum said, "Don't worry, the goddess is guiding him." That's not exactly the kind of motivational speech most parents would give, but in his case it kept the flame alive. What's amazing is how he never gave up on himself. Most people would have quit. He could have accepted a modest life, put away his notebooks, and forgotten about grand mathematical dreams. But he didn't. He kept believing in his gift, even when nobody else did. That's courage, that's stubbornness, and maybe that's the only reason his work survived long enough to reach the right eyes later. Here's a thought. Maybe loneliness is sometimes the price of genius. To see things nobody else sees, you have to walk roads nobody else walks. And for Ramanujan, those lonely roads were filled with numbers, infinite series stretching into the darkness, waiting for him to follow. Of course, this loneliness couldn't last forever. Slowly, very slowly, his work began to spread. Letters would soon start travelling across the seas. One of those letters would end up in the hands of G.H. Hardy, one of the most famous mathematicians in England, and that's when everything would change. But before that turning point, there was this period of isolation, a time when he was truly alone against the world, just a dropout, a poor man, an unknown scribbler, and yet, in that obscurity, his genius kept growing, kept expanding, like a fire no one could put out. That's the paradox of Ramanujan. He was isolated, but never defeated, alone, but never broken, misunderstood, but never silenced. And in those years of solitude, with no one cheering him on, he laid down some of the most astonishing mathematics ever written. So when you think about greatness, don't just picture the spotlight moments. Remember the quiet ones, the years of rejection, the endless nights of scribbling, the world turning its back while you keep going anyway. That was Ramanujan's life in this chapter. Alone against the world, but never against the numbers. By now, Ramanujan had filled his notebooks with thousands of formulas. He was living proof that obsession could survive poverty, illness, and a complete lack of academic credentials. But there was still a problem. You can't exactly become a famous mathematician by showing your mum your scribbles and saying, "Look, the goddess gave me this one." If he wanted the world to notice, he had to reach out. He had to find someone somewhere who could understand what he was doing. And so began one of the most extraordinary letter-writing campaigns in the history of mathematics. Picture the scene. It's early 1910s India. A young man sits in a small, dimly lit room. On his desk, scraps of paper, worn-out notebooks, a candle. Outside, the sounds of temple bells and street vendors. Inside, the silence of numbers pressing on his brain. demanding to be shared, and in front of him, sheets of paper that would soon travel thousands of miles across the ocean to England. Ramanujan began writing to mathematicians in Britain. He didn't know them personally. He had no connections, no introductions, no glowing letters of recommendation, just raw faith in his own work. He'd fill pages with formulas and identities, some of them so strange that even experts would scratch their heads, and then he'd post them, hoping that somewhere, someone would care. Most of the time they didn't. Some letters were ignored, some probably ended up in the trash. Imagine being a British professor in 1912, opening your mail to find a random letter from India stuffed with endless equations and no explanations. You'd probably think, another crank, because academics get those kinds of letters all the time. Even today, math departments get emails from self-proclaimed geniuses who say they've solved unsolvable problems. 99% of the time they're nonsense, and without formal training or proofs, Ramanujan looked like one of them. But he kept trying, and then one day, his letter reached the right person, G.H. Hardy. Now, Hardy was no ordinary mathematician. He was one of the giants of early 20th century math, a man famous for his brilliance, his sharp wit, and his love of pure mathematics. He was also famously blunt. If he thought your work was trash, he'd say so without hesitation. In other words, he was the perfect test for Ramanujan's ideas. Ramanujan's letter arrived in January 1913. It was about 9 pages long, packed with equations, many of them without proofs. Hardy sat down with his colleague J.E. Littlewood, and they started going through it. At first glance, it looked insane. The formulas were so unusual, so alien, that they didn't know what to make of them. But the more they looked, the more astonished they became. There's a famous line Hardy later used to describe the moment. He said it was the most remarkable thing I have ever received. And then he said something even more striking. They must be true, because if they were not true, no one would have had the imagination to invent them. Think about that. The formulas were so unusual that Hardy realized no fraud could have made them up. A fraud would make mistakes. A fraud would imitate known math. But these results were beyond imitation. They were either the work of a genius or the work of madness, and Hardy knew which one it was. This was the moment Ramanujan's life changed. Up until then, he had been writing into the void. Now, for the first time, the void wrote back. Hardy saw him, recognized him, and began corresponding with him seriously. That recognition was the bridge Ramanujan needed to cross the seas. But let's pause for a second and imagine the courage it took. Ramanujan was a poor clerk in Madras with no degree, no fame, and no reason to believe the great minds of Britain would listen. Yet he sent those letters anyway. That's bold, that's risky, and honestly, that's kind of hilarious if you think about it, because most of us wouldn't even DM a celebrity on Instagram for fear of being ignored. Ramanujan basically DM'd the mathematical equivalent of Einstein and said, "Hey, I've got some equations, want to check them out?" And it worked. There's also something deeply human in those letters. You can almost hear his desperation between the lines. He wasn't just showing off, he needed someone to validate his work. He needed someone to believe in him, and when Hardy responded, it wasn't just the start of a collaboration, it was salvation. It was proof that all those nights scribbling by candlelight hadn't been madness. Of course, Hardy wasn't instantly convinced by everything. Some of Ramanujan's formulas were wrong, or at least incomplete, but enough of them were stunningly correct that Hardy realized he was dealing with a once-in-a-century mind. He immediately began making plans to bring Ramanujan to Cambridge. This wasn't easy. Remember, this was colonial-era Britain. An Indian clerk with no degree wasn't exactly the kind of person who got invited to one of the world's most prestigious universities. There were cultural barriers, bureaucratic barriers, even health barriers, but Hardy was determined. He wrote letters, made arrangements, and slowly pulled the strings to get Ramanujan across the seas. Looking back, it's easy to see this as destiny, but at the time it was anything but certain. Those letters could easily have been ignored. Hardy could easily have dismissed him. Ramanujan could have given up after the first dozen rejections. But he didn't. He kept writing until someone listened. And that's why this chapter matters. It's the reminder that genius doesn't always shine in the right place at the right time. Sometimes it's hidden in a poor clerk's notebook, waiting for a letter to cross an ocean. Sometimes it takes faith, persistence, and just a little bit of luck. So the stage was set. On one side of the world, a poor Indian mathematician with notebooks full of dreams. On the other side, a brilliant British mathematician ready to unlock that potential. And between them, a letter. 9 pages of impossible equations that changed the history of mathematics. The seas had been crossed, at least on paper. Soon Ramanujan himself would make the journey. And that journey would be even stranger, harder, and more extraordinary than anyone could have imagined. So let's set the scene. It's January 1913. G.H. Hardy, one of the sharpest mathematicians in England, is sitting in his office at Trinity College, Cambridge. He opens a letter that looks ordinary enough. The handwriting is neat but foreign. The return address, Madras, India. Inside, 9 pages of dense equations, no explanations, no proofs, just formulas upon formulas upon formulas. Now, Hardy was used to getting weird letters. Even back then, math departments attracted their fair share of eccentric geniuses who sent unsolicited mail claiming to have solved every unsolved problem in history. Most of it was nonsense, but Hardy was polite enough, or maybe just curious enough, to give this one a closer look. He spread the pages out on his desk and called in his younger colleague, J.E. Littlewood. Together, they began reading. At first, Hardy frowned. The formulas were bizarre. They didn't look like anything he had seen before. They weren't arranged like normal mathematics with careful step-by-step reasoning. It was as if someone had opened a fire hydrant of math and just let it spray all over the page. There were infinite series, elliptic functions, modular equations, partition identities, some correct, some suspicious, all strange. Hardy, who prided himself on his rational mind, had a choice to make. He could shrug, say, "Just another crank," and toss the letter in the wastebasket. Or he could do the harder thing, take it seriously. Lucky for Ramanujan, Hardy was in a curious mood that day. The more they studied, the more stunned they became. Some of the results were already known but scattered and obscure. Others were new, completely new and breathtakingly original. Hardy realized something remarkable. These weren't the formulas of a fraud. They were too unusual, too imaginative. No one could invent results like this unless they truly understood something profound. That's when Hardy said his famous line, "They must be true, because if they were not true, no one would have had the imagination to invent them." Think about that. Usually in math, imagination isn't the test of truth. Proof is. Logic is. But Ramanujan's work was so strange, so original, that Hardy recognized it had to come from genuine genius. Even when the results were incomplete, the insights were dazzling. Hardy later admitted that reading that letter was the single most important moment of his mathematical career. But let's add some humour here. Imagine being Littlewood. You're in your 20s, still carving out your academic reputation, and suddenly your mentor hands you 9 pages from a random clerk in India and says, "Look at this, I think we've found a genius." You'd probably squint, pretend to understand and quietly panic because half the formulas look like alien code. It must have been surreal. The formulas themselves were wild. One of them gave a rapidly converging series for p, far faster than anything known at the time. Another hinted at deep results in number theory, connections nobody had ever seen. There were results about partition functions, modular equations, continued fractions, fields Hardy knew well. And yet Ramanujan was producing results that had never been written down before. Here's an example. Ramanujan wrote an identity involving partitions that seemed to come out of nowhere. Hardy and Littlewood looked at it and realized it wasn't just correct, it hinted a whole new theory. Decades later, those ideas would ripple into modern mathematics, influencing everything from cryptography to string theory. And here they were, scribbled in pencil by a man half a world away, with no formal training. Hardy and Littlewood spent hours combing through the letter. They circled results, whispered to each other, argued, laughed in disbelief. By the end of it, they knew this wasn't a hoax, this wasn't a crank, this was a phenomenon. Now, Hardy wasn't easily impressed. He was a hard man to flatter. He once joked that he hated applied mathematics because it was too practical. He cared only for pure math, beautiful abstract structures that served no purpose other than to exist. He famously said that nothing he ever did would be of any practical use, and he was proud of that. So for someone like Hardy to be awestruck by Ramanujan's work tells you everything you need to know. This was the start of one of the strangest and most beautiful collaborations in math history. Hardy, the cold rationalist, Ramanujan, the mystical dreamer, one obsessed with proof, the other with inspiration. One trained in the world's greatest universities, the other a self-taught clerk scribbling by candlelight. Together they were about to create magic. But Hardy didn't just want to write letters back and forth. He wanted Ramanujan in Cambridge. He wanted him there, in person, working side by side. That decision set in motion the next chapter of Ramanujan's life, the journey across the ocean, the culture clash, the unlikely friendship that would shape both their lives. Before we get to that though, let's pause to admire the absurdity. Think about how close this whole story came to never happening. If Hardy had been in a bad mood that day, he might have tossed the letter aside. If Littlewood had shrugged and said, "Looks fake," maybe Hardy would have agreed. If the post had been lost at sea, or if Ramanujan had given up after his earlier rejections, history might never have heard his name. Instead, by some combination of luck, persistence and genius, the right eyes landed on the right pages at the right time, and the world of mathematics would never be the same. The 9-page letter from India didn't just impress Hardy, it humbled him. Hardy later said he had never met a mathematician who was so great in his own field as Ramanujan. Coming from a man with Hardy's ego, that's saying something. He compared Ramanujan to Euler and Jacobi, two of the greatest mathematicians of all time. That's the level he placed him on. So when Hardy read the impossible, he didn't dismiss it. He embraced it. And in doing so, he opened the door for Ramanujan to step out of obscurity and into history. And that brings us to the next chapter, crossing the ocean. Because as remarkable as the letter was, it was only the beginning. Ramanujan still had to leave his world behind, board a ship and face a life in Cambridge that would test him in ways his notebooks never had. The letter had done its work. Hardy was convinced. Littlewood was convinced. The mathematical world had just discovered a comet blazing across the sky, and now the next step was obvious: get Ramanujan to Cambridge. Easier said than done. For one thing, this was 1914. The world was about to plunge into the First World War. International travel wasn't exactly a casual affair. Add to that the fact that Ramanujan was a poor clerk in Madras, with no money, no passport, and a deeply religious family that frowned upon crossing the ocean. In traditional Hindu culture at the time, crossing the seas was taboo. It was believed to make you ritually impure. To leave India by ship was to risk your soul, not just your stomach. So when Hardy sent the invitation, Ramanujan hesitated. He wanted to go, he longed to work with real mathematicians who could understand him, but he also didn't want to defy his mother and his religion. This could have been the end of the story right here. But then, according to legend, his mother had a dream. In it, the family goddess Namagiri appeared and gave her blessing. The goddess basically said, "Don't worry, your boy is destined for greatness. Let him go." And just like that, permission was granted. Divine green light. Of course, divine blessings don't buy boat tickets. Ramanujan still needed money. Fortunately, local supporters, including officials at the University of Madras, stepped in and arranged funding. Suddenly, this poor dropout with no degree had backing to sail to the heart of the mathematical world. And so, in March 1914, Srinivasa Ramanujan boarded a ship and left India for the first time in his life. Now pause and imagine that journey. This wasn't a quick flight with in-flight movies and complimentary peanuts. This was weeks at sea. Ramanujan, a strict vegetarian, had to survive on whatever food he could manage, often just bread and fruit. He was sickly to begin with, and seasickness didn't help. The ship rolled through the waves past foreign ports. While he sat with his notebook scribbling formulas as always, other passengers probably thought, "What's that skinny guy doing with all those scraps of paper?" Meanwhile, he was writing mathematics that would still puzzle scholars a century later. When the ship finally docked in England, Ramanujan stepped onto a land utterly alien to him. Cold, grey, raining more days than not. Cambridge, with its Gothic towers and ivy-covered colleges, must have looked like another planet compared to the temples and heat of Tamil Nadu. And then there was the food. Oh, the food. Imagine going from spicy South Indian cooking to bland British wartime rations. Boiled potatoes, porridge, tea with milk. Ramanujan, ever faithful to his vegetarian diet, struggled to find meals he could eat. There are stories of him living on little more than milk, bread, and a few vegetables. Hardy later joked that Ramanujan probably survived on a diet that would kill any normal person. But food wasn't the only culture shock. There were also the social norms. Cambridge was a place of suits, formality, Latin mottos, and centuries-old traditions. Ramanujan showed up in simple clothes, with the manners of a modest Indian clerk, and the quiet air of someone who didn't quite belong. Students whispered, professors stared. He was, by every measure, an outsider. And yet, none of it mattered when he sat down with Hardy, because on paper, in formulas, he wasn't an outsider. He was a giant. The collaboration began almost immediately. Hardy introduced Ramanujan to the Cambridge mathematical community, and the reactions were mixed. Some admired him, some doubted him, some thought he was a curiosity, like a performing prodigy. But when they saw his results, most agreed. This was no trick. This was brilliance. Still, the adjustment was hard. Imagine trying to work in an academic system you'd never trained in. Hardy insisted on proofs, rigor, formalism. Ramanujan was used to intuition, to writing down results without justification. Their early discussions must have been frustrating. Hardy would ask, "How do you know this is true?" Ramanujan would shrug and say, "The goddess told me." Not exactly the kind of answer that flies in a peer-reviewed journal. But Hardy was patient. He helped polish Ramanujan's work, frame it in formal terms, and present it to the academic world. And in return, Ramanujan astonished Hardy with ideas that seemed to come from nowhere. Hardy once compared collaborating with Ramanujan to a mathematician being shown the Garden of Eden. That's how fresh, how untouched his ideas felt. Meanwhile, outside the classroom, the war raged on. Cambridge was quieter than usual. Many students were gone, serving at the front. Food shortages grew worse. Life was bleak. And yet, in the middle of all this, Ramanujan and Hardy worked side by side, creating mathematics that transcended their grim surroundings. But the personal challenges didn't go away. Ramanujan grew lonely. He missed his family, his culture, his food. He battled depression and poor health. England's cold climate didn't suit him, and the more he struggled physically, the more his mind seemed to burn with creativity. It was as if his body grew weaker while his mathematics grew stronger. There's something heroic and tragic about this. A man uprooted from his world, surviving on bread and tea, wrapped in a scarf against the cold, while inside his head, infinite series unfolded like galaxies. Outsiders saw a quiet, frail foreigner. Hardy saw a mind that rivaled the greatest in history. Crossing the ocean wasn't just about geography. It was about crossing boundaries of culture, religion, health, and prejudice. It was about leaving behind the familiar and stepping into the unknown, driven only by faith in numbers. And that leap changed everything. Without it, Ramanujan might have remained a local curiosity in Madras, his notebooks forgotten. With it, he became immortal. His journey across the ocean was more than a voyage. It was a bridge between worlds, between East and West, mysticism and logic, intuition and proof. The ship had carried more than a man. It had carried an entire universe of mathematics. And now, in Cambridge, that universe was about to collide with Hardy's, creating sparks that still glow today. When Ramanujan first sat down with Hardy in Cambridge, it must have felt like two worlds colliding. On one side of the table, G.H. Hardy, the ultimate rationalist, an English gentleman, precise, sceptical, obsessed with logic and proof. On the other side, Ramanujan, a quiet Indian clerk who claimed goddesses whispered equations into his dreams. Honestly, if this were a buddy comedy, you couldn't write a stranger pairing, and yet somehow it worked. Hardy was fascinated. He had spent his life swimming in the carefully charted waters of mathematics. Every theorem had to be supported by a chain of logic so strong that not even the tiniest doubt could slip through. Ramanujan, by contrast, operated like a surfer on a stormy sea of intuition. He didn't bother proving things, he just knew them. He'd write down an identity involving infinite series or modular forms, and when Hardy asked how he knew it was correct, Ramanujan would shrug and say, "The goddess told me." For Hardy, this was both thrilling and exasperating. Thrilling because the results were unlike anything he had ever seen. Exasperating because you can't exactly publish "Goddess said so" in a math journal. so their collaboration settled into a rhythm. Ramanujan would throw out dazzling results, and Hardy, sometimes with Littlewood, would work on proving them, cleaning them up, making them fit into the neat framework of Western mathematics. Think of it like a band. Ramanujan was the improvising jazz soloist, making wild, unexpected leaps. Hardy was the disciplined conductor, making sure the music didn't collapse into chaos. Together they created a sound the world had never heard before. It wasn't always smooth. At first, Hardy thought Ramanujan's methods were sloppy. He worried that some of the formulas might collapse under scrutiny, and indeed a few of them did. But the vast majority held up, and many opened entirely new paths in number theory. Slowly, Hardy came to see that while Ramanujan's intuition seemed mystical, it was also incredibly accurate. In fact, Hardy began to trust Ramanujan's instincts even when he didn't understand them. If Ramanujan wrote down a formula, Hardy assumed it was probably true, even if it would take years to prove. Ramanujan, for his part, learned to appreciate Hardy's rigor. He didn't suddenly fall in love with proofs, but he began to see the value of shaping his ideas into something the broader math community could digest. Hardy gave him structure. Ramanujan gave Hardy wonder. Their personalities couldn't have been more different. Hardy was outspoken, competitive, and proudly atheist. He once said he considered believing in God as absurd as believing in Santa Claus. Ramanujan, meanwhile, was deeply spiritual, humble, and gentle. He credited all his discoveries to his family goddess. Hardy lived in a world of cricket matches, pints of beer, and academic rivalries. Ramanujan lived in a world of prayer, vegetarian meals, and visions in dreams. And yet they respected each other deeply. Hardy once wrote that Ramanujan was the most romantic figure in the recent history of mathematics. Romantic not in the love sense, but in the sense of mystery and beauty. For Hardy, who spent his life chasing elegance in equations, Ramanujan embodied the very essence of what made math magical. There are countless stories of their collaboration. One day, Ramanujan handed Hardy a formula involving the partition function, the number of ways an integer can be broken into sums. Hardy stared at it in disbelief. It was so far beyond anything he or Littlewood had ever seen, and yet when they checked it, it was right. Another time, Ramanujan produced new series for calculating pi, formulas so efficient that a century later, computers still use them. Hardy often said he felt like a gardener discovering a wild jungle filled with exotic flowers. His job was simply to label them, categorize them, and show the world what Ramanujan had grown. But collaboration isn't just about work. They spent time together outside of equations too. Hardy, who wasn't known for being warm, actually grew protective of Ramanujan. He worried about his health, his diet, his loneliness in a foreign land. He tried to help him navigate Cambridge life, though sometimes with mixed success. Ramanujan, shy and modest, often preferred to stay in his room, scribbling formulas late into the night. There's a famous story Hardy told later. He once visited Ramanujan in the hospital and remarked that the taxi he came in had the rather dull number 1729. Ramanujan immediately replied, "No, it is a very interesting number. It is the smallest number expressible as the sum of two cubes in two different ways." That quick response amazed Hardy, not just for its brilliance, but for how naturally numbers flowed from Ramanujan's mind, even in moments of illness. Their collaboration wasn't equal in the traditional sense. Hardy had the status, the platform, the power to get Ramanujan's work published. Ramanujan had the raw ideas, the creative spark. Some critics later wondered if Hardy took too much credit, but most agree that without Hardy, Ramanujan's work might never have reached the world, and without Ramanujan, Hardy's career would never have reached its legendary heights. Together they published a string of papers that shook number theory. They introduced new ideas in partitions, modular forms, infinite series. They solved problems that had puzzled mathematicians for centuries. They even created brand new problems, ones that mathematicians are still working on today. What made it all so strange was the balance. Hardy demanded logic. Ramanujan demanded faith. Hardy asked for reasons. Ramanujan offered visions. And yet somehow, instead of clashing, these opposites fused. Like yin and yang, like order and chaos, they needed each other. Looking back, Hardy once said that his collaboration with Ramanujan was the one romantic incident of his life. That's how deeply it moved him. For a man as reserved and logical as Hardy, that's high praise. he saw in Ramanujan not just a colleague, but a miracle. So in this chapter of his life, Ramanujan was no longer completely alone. He had found a partner, a strange partner, yes, but one who could finally translate his dream-born visions into something the mathematical world could hear. Together they weren't just solving problems, they were redefining what mathematics could be. The strange collaboration of Hardy and Ramanujan stands today as one of the great pairings in science, not because they were similar, but because they were different. They proved that logic and intuition, proof and vision, reason and faith could sit at the same table and create wonders, and the wonders were just beginning. One of the strangest things about Ramanujan's work was how he treated proofs. To Hardy and the rest of the Cambridge world, proofs were sacred. Proofs were the law. In mathematics, you can't just say something is true, you have to prove it. It's the foundation of the entire discipline. No proof, no theorem, simple as that. But Ramanujan didn't play by those rules. He would write down formulas, breathtaking, original, mind-blowing formulas, and just move on. No justification, no explanation, no careful chain of logic. Just result after result, scribbled like notes in the margin of reality. To his Western colleagues, this was shocking. Hardy would stare at a formula and say, "But why is this true?" And Ramanujan would reply, calmly, "Because it is." Sometimes he added, "The goddess showed me." That wasn't exactly the answer Hardy was looking for. But the crazy part? Most of the time, Ramanujan was right. It's not that he couldn't prove things, he sometimes did. But he was impatient. He didn't see the point of spending hours grinding through logical steps when the truth was already obvious to him. For Ramanujan, mathematics wasn't about the journey, it was about the destination. He wanted to collect the results, not the explanations. He was like a treasure hunter piling up gold but refusing to draw a map. This drove Hardy nuts. Hardy lived for rigor. He once said he valued elegance in a proof above almost anything else. For him, the beauty of mathematics wasn't just in the results but in the reasoning that led you there. Ramanujan, on the other hand, seemed to skip the reasoning entirely. It was as if Hardy were writing novels and Ramanujan was scribbling only the punchlines. But here's where it gets interesting. Some of the results Ramanujan wrote down without proofs were so advanced that even today, a century later, mathematicians are still working to understand them. His notebooks are full of formulas that seem to come out of nowhere. Identities, series, product expansions, some proven later, some still mysterious. Imagine stumbling into a cave and finding hundreds of strange jewels scattered on the ground, with no explanation of where they came from. That's what mathematicians felt when they opened Ramanujan's notebooks. Take his work on infinite series for pi. He wrote down formulas that converged so fast they made existing methods look like snail mail compared to email. He didn't bother proving them, he just wrote them. Later, mathematicians confirmed they were correct. In fact, some of them became the backbone of modern algorithms for computing billions of digits of pi. Or consider his work on partition numbers, the number of ways to write an integer as a sum. He came up with results that predicted patterns nobody else had seen. He just dropped them in his notebook like casual doodles. Years later, Hardy and others built entire theories around them. And then there were the results that seemed completely insane. Formulas so strange that even Hardy doubted them at first. Yet, more often than not, they turned out to be true. The few that were wrong were usually just slightly off, like a genius who writes the right answer on the wrong line of the exam paper. So how did he do it? Was he guessing? Was he just lucky? Hardy didn't think so. He believed Ramanujan had a kind of mathematical intuition that was unlike anyone else's. Most mathematicians need to reason step by step. Ramanujan seemed to leap directly to the conclusion. His brain connected patterns at a level so deep it bypassed the need for conventional proof. He could see the structure of mathematics the way an artist sees a finished painting before a single brushstroke is made. But while this intuition was extraordinary, it also caused problems. Without proofs, his work couldn't easily be published. The academic world needed rigor, not just inspiration. That's where Hardy came in. Hardy and Littlewood spent countless hours trying to supply the missing proofs, turning Ramanujan's raw results into formal mathematics. It was exhausting work, but it also led to some of the most fruitful collaborations in the history of number theory. Think about how strange this dynamic was. Normally the hard part of math is finding the results. Proofs, while difficult, come later, but with Ramanujan it was the opposite. The results poured out of him like water. The proofs were the hard part. His colleagues had to run behind him, trying to catch up, trying to explain the miracles he had casually tossed over his shoulder. And there's a kind of humour in that. Imagine working with a colleague who keeps handing you gold bars and saying, "Here, figure out where I dug these up." You'd be grateful, sure, but also slightly overwhelmed. That was Hardy's life with Ramanujan, a non-stop shower of results, each demanding years of follow-up. It also raises a philosophical question. Is a result valuable without a proof? In mathematics, the traditional answer is no, but Ramanujan challenged that. His results were so often correct that they forced mathematicians to rethink what intuition could achieve. He blurred the line between discovery and invention, between faith and logic. Even today, people argue about what to make of his style. Was he careless, or was he simply operating at a level beyond normal rules? Maybe both, but whatever the case, his theorems without proofs left a legacy as strange as it is profound. To this day, mathematicians are still mining Ramanujan's notebooks for gems. In the 1970s, researchers discovered one of his lost notebooks, filled with hundreds of results he never published. Many of them are still being studied. More than 50 years after his death, Ramanujan was still surprising the world with ideas he had scribbled down without explanation. So yes, Hardy may have grumbled about the lack of proofs. He may have torn his hair out trying to turn Ramanujan's intuition into rigorous papers, but deep down he knew he was witnessing something unique, something that couldn't be measured by ordinary standards. Ramanujan wasn't just a mathematician, he was something stranger, a dreamer of numbers, a seer of patterns, a man who treated proofs as optional. And maybe that's why his story still fascinates us, because he showed that mathematics, which we think of as cold and logical, can also be wild, mysterious and intuitive, that sometimes the truth doesn't arrive in neat steps. Sometimes it just falls from the sky, unproven, unexplained, but dazzling all the same. Ramanujan's theorems without proofs weren't flaws, they were his fingerprint, his signature style, the mark of a genius who saw math not as a series of problems to be solved, but as visions to be recorded. Proofs could come later. What mattered was capturing the vision before it slipped away. And that vision would keep dazzling the world, one unproven theorem at a time. Now we come to one of Ramanujan's most famous obsessions, partitions. And no, I don't mean room dividers or those little walls they put between cubicles at boring office jobs. I mean partition numbers, the different ways you can break down an integer into sums. Here's a simple example. Take the number 4. How many ways can you write 4 as a sum of smaller positive integers? Well, let's see. 4, 3, 1, 1, 2 is 2, 2 and 1 times 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. That's 5 ways. So mathematicians say the partition of 4, easy, right? But as the numbers get bigger, the number of partitions explodes. The partition of 10, for example, is 42. For 100, it's more than 190 million. Suddenly, what started as a cute counting game turns into a monster problem. This kind of problem was exactly the sort of thing Ramanujan loved. While other mathematicians were sweating over classical problems, he dove headfirst into partitions, and what he discovered was mind-bending. He and Hardy developed an approximation formula for the partition function Pn, basically a way to estimate how many partitions a number has. Their formula wasn't just good, it was scary good. It gave insanely accurate estimates for enormous numbers. Imagine being able to guess the number of ways to split, say 10,000 into sums, without actually calculating all of them. That's what their formula did. It turned chaos into order. But Ramanujan didn't stop there. He noticed strange patterns in partitions. For example, he discovered congruences, hidden rules about how partition numbers behave when divided by certain numbers. One of his most famous results, the number of partitions of any number that's a multiple of 5, like 5, 10, 15 and so on, is always divisible by 5. Same with multiples of 7 and 11. These were shocking discoveries. Nobody saw them coming. Hardy once admitted he had no idea how Ramanujan spotted these patterns. They weren't obvious. They weren't written in any textbook. Ramanujan just saw them, like a magician pulling coins out of thin air, and mathematicians are still working out the full consequences of those insights. To put this into perspective, partition theory became one of the central areas of number theory in the 20th century. It connects to modular forms, Q-series, and even modern physics. In string theory, for example, partition functions play a role in counting quantum states. So when physicists today talk about the structure of the universe, there are echoes of Ramanujan's partitions hidden in their equations. But let's not get too technical. Let's zoom back and enjoy the sheer weirdness of it. Here's this sickly Indian clerk, scribbling in his notebooks, and he casually discovers patterns in partitions that would later connect to the deepest mysteries of the cosmos. Meanwhile, most of us struggle to partition a pizza evenly among friends without someone complaining. Hardy loved to tell the story of how Ramanujan would present these results. He'd walk into Hardy's office with a notebook, flip it open, and point to some equation like, see, p pi 5n plus 4 is divisible by 5. Hardy would blink and say, okay, how do you know? And Ramanujan would shrug, it just is. Then Hardy would spend days or weeks proving it while Ramanujan had already moved on to the next revelation. It's almost comedic. Imagine working with a colleague who drops life-changing results in your inbox with no explanation, then disappears for lunch. That was life with Ramanujan. One of the wildest things about partitions is how they sneak into unexpected places. For example, they connect to statistical mechanics, the math behind gases and heat. They show up in cryptography, the math behind secure codes. They even have links to black holes. Yes, black holes. Those cosmic vacuum cleaners that eat stars for breakfast. Physicists use partition-like functions to count the possible quantum states of a black hole's surface, and in some of those formulas, Ramanujan's fingerprints are right there. Think about that for a moment. A boy in South India, without formal training, scribbling partitions in his notebook, and a century later, those same partitions help physicists understand the edge of a black hole. If that doesn't blow your mind, I don't know what will. Of course, during his time, Ramanujan didn't know about black holes. He wasn't thinking about string theory. He just loved numbers. He followed them where they led, and somehow they led him into truths that reached far beyond his lifetime. There's a lesson here about curiosity. Ramanujan didn't study partitions because they were useful. He studied them because they were beautiful, because they fascinated him, because he couldn't let go of the patterns he saw. And in the end, that curiosity unlocked doors nobody even knew existed. Hardy later said that Ramanujan's work on partitions was among the most extraordinary he had ever seen. He placed him alongside Euler and Jacobi, the great masters of number theory, and that's not a comparison Hardy made lightly. But the beauty of this chapter isn't just in the math, it's in the image of Ramanujan, sitting with his notebook lost in thought, seeing order in chaos. Where the rest of the world saw overwhelming complexity, he saw harmony. Numbers didn't just obey rules, they sang to him, and partitions were one of his favourite songs. So next time you look at a big messy problem and think, there's no pattern here, it's hopeless, remember Ramanujan. He looked at something as messy as breaking down numbers and found divine order. He proved that even in chaos there are secrets waiting to be discovered. And that's why he's remembered, not just as a mathematician, but as a genius of partitions. Few numbers in mathematics have captured the imagination of humans like pi. You know it. 3.14159. And then a parade of digits that just keeps marching into infinity. Ancient Babylonians tried to estimate it. Archimedes gave us clever approximations. Countless students have had nightmares about it. And somewhere in the middle of all this history comes Ramanujan, a man who looked at pi and said, I can do better. And oh boy did he. Remember, pi isn't just some trivia number you see on March 14th when nerds eat pie and make bad puns. Pi is everywhere. Circles, waves, probability, physics, it pops up in the strangest places. It's one of those constants that feels less like a number and more like a fingerprint of the universe. And for centuries, people wanted to know it with greater and greater precision. By the early 1900s, mathematicians had formulas for pi, but they were slow, painfully slow. If you wanted even a few hundred digits, you had to spend forever crunching numbers. Then along comes Ramanujan, with his notebooks full of what looked like magical incantations, Out spill formulas for pi that converge so fast they made everyone else look like amateurs. Here's the deal. Converge means how quickly does a formula get you closer to the true value. Think of it like filling a glass with water. Some formulas dribble in drop by drop, taking ages to get anywhere. Ramanujan's formulas pour water into the glass by the gallon. One of his famous series can compute 8 digits of pi with just one term. 8 digits! That's like solving a 1,000-piece puzzle after putting down a single piece. Mathematicians looked at these formulas and just shook their heads. How had he come up with this? Hardy was astonished. He had never seen anything like it. Some of the series Ramanujan produced were so elegant they seemed to come straight from the gods, and Ramanujan himself said, yes, that's exactly what happened. The goddess Namagiri had whispered them to him. Now you might think, okay, neat party trick, but what's the big deal? Well, here's the kicker. Decades later, when computers arrived, Ramanujan's pi formulas turned out to be gold. They became the foundation for modern algorithms that calculate billions, literally billions of digits of pi. His intuition was so far ahead of his time that technology had to catch up before we could fully appreciate it. It's almost comical. Imagine scribbling something in your notebook in 1910, and then, 100 years later, supercomputers are using it to push the boundaries of mathematics. Ramanujan didn't just outpace his contemporaries, he outpaced the future. But the mystery isn't just in the formulas themselves, it's in the question how. How did he do it? He had no advanced textbooks, no access to the cutting-edge research of the West. He didn't know calculus in the formal way Cambridge students did, and yet he produced results that left professional mathematicians gaping. One explanation is that Ramanujan had a different relationship with numbers. He didn't see them as abstract symbols, he felt them, he intuited them. To him, pi wasn't just a number, it was an entity, something alive, something whispering its secrets if you knew how to listen. Where others saw complexity, he saw patterns. Where others saw endless digits, he saw structure. There's a beautiful symmetry to this. Pi is infinite, chaotic, never repeating, yet hidden in that chaos are deep, elegant patterns. And who better to glimpse them than a man who dreamed numbers? Let's add a touch of humour. Most of us, when asked to work with pi, punch it into a calculator and move on. If we're feeling fancy, maybe we memorize 3.14159 to impress friends. Ramanujan, on the other hand, basically looked pi in the eye and said, I know your secrets. That's the difference between a genius and the rest of us. His pi work wasn't just a sideshow. It connected deeply to other parts of mathematics, like modular forms and elliptic functions. At the time, these connections were mysterious. Today, they're central to modern number theory. Once again, Ramanujan had stumbled into the future without a roadmap. Think about how this must have felt for Hardy and the Cambridge mathematicians. Here was this soft-spoken man, often ill, far from home, and yet dropping formulas that could shake the foundations of mathematics. It must have been both exhilarating and humbling. Hardy admitted more than once that Ramanujan's insights were beyond him. He could prove them, yes, but he could not have invented them. That required something Hardy didn't have. Ramanujan's strange mystical intuition. And so Pali became one of the great showcases of Ramanujan's genius. Not because the world needed more digits. Nobody really needs to know Pali to a trillion places, but because it demonstrated how far his mind could leap. His pi formulas were like windows into another mathematical dimension, glimpses of truths that nobody else could see. Fast forward to today, and Ramanujan's fingerprints are still all over the world of pi. When researchers set records for calculating digits, when supercomputers churn through trillions of places, his series are often at the heart of it. Every new milestone in pi is in some way a tribute to a man who died in 1920 but dreamed centuries ahead. And that's the mystery. Not pi itself, though. Pi is plenty mysterious. But the way Ramanujan unlocked it. Without the training, without the resources, without the proofs, he somehow wrote down results that stood the test of time. So when we talk about pi, let's not just think about circles and calculators. Let's think about a skinny man in South India, scribbling by candlelight, smiling at patterns only he could see. Let's think about the goddess whispering in dreams, about Hardy shaking his head in disbelief, about the long chain of mathematicians and computers that would one day follow his lead. For most of us, pi is just a number. For Ramanujan, it was a mystery worth dreaming about. And in solving that mystery, he reminded us that mathematics isn't just about logic, it's also about wonder. For Hardy, mathematics was pure logic. Cold, clean, beautiful logic. He once said he didn't believe in God, he didn't believe in immortality, he didn't believe in anything mystical. Numbers to him were not divine whispers but human constructions that lived and died by proof. Ramanujan could not have been more different. To him, numbers weren't human inventions, they were eternal truths, written into the fabric of the universe by something greater, and he believed wholeheartedly that his insights came not from himself, but from the goddess Namagiri. Namagiri was the family deity worshipped in his hometown of Kumbakonam. His mother was deeply devoted to her, and Ramanujan inherited that devotion. He believed Namagiri appeared to him in dreams, sometimes writing equations on the walls of his mind. He didn't see himself as the author of his work. He saw himself as a vessel, a messenger. This belief shaped his entire approach to mathematics. Where Hardy demanded proof, Ramanujan trusted inspiration. Where Hardy saw rigor, Ramanujan saw revelation. For him, writing down formulas was almost like prayer, a sacred duty. And here's the funny part. Imagine these two men sitting in a room together. Hardy, the atheist, sipping tea and demanding logical steps. Ramanujan, the mystic, calmly saying, "The goddess gave me this result." It's almost like an odd couple sitcom. You couldn't script a stranger academic partnership. But somehow it worked. Hardy didn't believe in goddesses, but he believed in results, and Ramanujan delivered results, over and over again. He might credit the divine, Hardy might credit intuition, but either way, the formulas stood. There's something deeply human in this tension. Throughout history, science and faith have often been cast as opposites, but in Ramanujan's life they danced together. His faith fueled his confidence. When the world doubted him, when he failed exams, when he was poor and sick, he kept going because he believed he was chosen. The goddess had given him a mission, and you don't quit a divine mission just because your math teacher doesn't like your homework. It also gave him humility. Unlike some geniuses who strut around bragging about their brilliance, Ramanujan never claimed ownership of his discoveries. He always said the credit belonged to Namagiri. In a way, that made him even more remarkable. He didn't see himself as the star. He saw himself as the instrument. Now, whether you believe in goddesses or not, there's something inspiring about that mindset. It takes a lot of pressure off. If the work succeeds, it's divine. If it fails, well, maybe the goddess was busy that day. Either way, you keep going. But let's add a bit of humour. Imagine if every modern scientist adopted Ramanujan's style, submitting a paper to a journal with the explanation, "I dreamed it, the goddess confirmed it, please accept." The reviewers would lose their minds. Peer review would collapse overnight. And yet, in Ramanujan's case, it worked. Not because journals suddenly became mystical, but because the results were simply too brilliant to ignore. One of my favourite contrasts is this. Hardy once said he believed only in mathematics itself, that it was the one thing that truly existed. For him, math was like a secular religion. Ramanujan, on the other hand, believed mathematics was literally divine, a language of God. Two men, same table, same chalkboard, same results, but completely opposite philosophies. And still, they made it work. This clash of perspectives also shaped their friendship. Hardy, with his sharp wit and skepticism, might have found Ramanujan's mysticism frustrating, but he also respected it. He knew that whatever its source, it produced results that humbled even him, and Ramanujan, gentle and modest, never pushed his beliefs on Hardy. He simply lived them. Their bond wasn't about agreement, it was about shared awe at the beauty of numbers. And maybe that's the deeper point. Mathematics has always carried a hint of the mystical. Pythagoras thought numbers were the essence of reality. Galileo said the universe was written in the language of mathematics. Even today, physicists marvel at the unreasonable effectiveness of math in describing the world. Whether you call it divine or not, math feels bigger than us. Ramanujan simply leaned into that feeling more openly than most. His faith also gave him resilience. Life in Cambridge was hard. The cold weather, the strange food, the loneliness. His health deteriorated. But through it all, he kept working, driven by the belief that his mathematics had a purpose beyond himself. Without that conviction, maybe he would have given up. With it, he pressed on even when his body failed. It's tempting to ask, was the goddess real? Did she really whisper equations to him? From a scientific standpoint, the answer is no. From a human standpoint, the answer is yes. Because whether it was divine intervention or subconscious intuition, the results were real. The goddess was Ramanujan's way of explaining something he couldn't explain, the mysterious well of creativity inside him. And honestly, who are we to argue? So in this chapter of his story, we see Ramanujan not just as a mathematician, but as a mystic, a man who bridged two worlds, the rational world of proofs and the spiritual world of visions. Hardy gave him rigor, Namagiri gave him faith. Between them, Ramanujan created mathematics that still astonishes us today. And that's the beauty of it. Numbers can be cold and logical, yes, but they can also be warm, mysterious, even divine. Ramanujan's life reminds us that mathematics isn't just about rules, it's also about wonder. And sometimes, maybe, it's about listening to the whispers in your dreams. Sometimes genius hides in plain sight. Other times it jumps out of nowhere, disguised as something totally ordinary. In Ramanujan's case, it once came disguised as the number on the side of a taxi. The story goes like this. Ramanujan was in the hospital in London, his health failing. Hardy, ever the loyal collaborator, came to visit. As he walked in, he tried to make conversation, maybe even lighten the mood. So he said, "I came in a taxi with the number 11729. It seemed to me rather a dull number." Now, pause for a moment. Most of us lying in a hospital bed might say, "Aha," and roll over. Ramanujan? He sat up and said, "No, Hardy, it is a very interesting number. It is the smallest number expressible as the sum of two cubes in two different ways." Just like that, no pause, no hesitation, just a spark of brilliance. And he was right. 1729, 1/3, Mayu Thode Kolv, and also 9 Thode Kolv, no smaller number can do that. This simple observation has since become famous as the first taxicab number. Mathematicians even gave it a formal name, Taxicab 2, and today the hunt continues for higher and higher taxicab numbers, all sparked by one casual remark in a hospital room. It's one of the most quoted stories in mathematics, and for good reason. It captures the essence of Ramanujan. Where others see dullness, he sees wonder. Where Hardy saw a boring taxi number, Ramanujan saw hidden beauty. Numbers weren't just tools to him, they were alive, each with its own secrets. Now let's add a little humour here. Imagine being Hardy in that moment. You've just tried small talk with your sick friend, and suddenly you've stumbled into an immortal piece of math history. Most of us can't even remember our taxi receipts. Ramanujan turned his into a theorem. It also shows how his mind worked differently. Most of us see numbers as static things. 1029 is just one more in an endless line of 4-digit integers. But to Ramanujan, numbers had personalities. They had quirks, hidden relationships, patterns waiting to be noticed. He treated them like friends with secrets, and when Hardy tossed him 1029, he immediately recognized its personality. This little story became legendary, but it's more than just a fun anecdote. It actually opened up a field of exploration. Mathematicians began asking what other numbers can be expressed as the sum of two cubes in multiple ways. How rare are they? How big do you have to go to find the next one? These are questions that still occupy number theorists today. For example, the next taxicab number after 1729 is 4104. Then comes 13832. The numbers get bigger and bigger, and the searches get harder and harder. By now, mathematicians and computers have pushed the sequence to dizzying heights, and all of it traces back to that hospital conversation. But the real magic is in the human side of the story. Ramanujan was gravely ill. His body was weak, yet his mind was as sharp as ever. Even lying in a hospital bed, he could instantly summon an obscure property of a random 4-digit number. That's not just intelligence. That's intuition at a level most of us can't even comprehend. Hardy later said that this exchange stuck with him for the rest of his life. It wasn't just the brilliance of the observation, it was the sheer Ramanujanness of it, the way his friend could find wonder in what seemed utterly dull. And maybe that's the deeper lesson. to see the extraordinary in the ordinary, to look at something as plain as a taxi number and discover hidden beauty. That's what made Ramanujan special. He didn't wait for grand problems or famous equations. He found magic everywhere. There's also a touch of irony here. Hardy, the great champion of pure mathematics, thought 1729 was boring. Ramanujan, the mystic dreamer, saw its hidden structure instantly. In that moment, it was as if the roles reversed. Hardy was the ordinary observer, Ramanujan was the seer. And ever since, 1729 has become a symbol. You'll find it on t-shirts, in books, on websites devoted to math trivia. It's the number that reminds us that genius can strike anywhere, even in the back of a London taxi. Let's be honest though, if most of us looked at 1729, we'd just think, 4 digits. Maybe if you're a nerd, you'd notice it's not prime. But that's it. Ramanujan, on the other hand, looked at it and saw an entire universe of relationships. That's why he was Ramanujan and we're not. There's also something oddly comforting about this story. It shows that genius doesn't always require grand stages or dramatic breakthroughs. Sometimes it's just a small remark in a hospital room, a quiet observation that turns out to be profound. It reminds us that mathematics isn't locked away in chalkboards and journals. It's hiding in everyday life, waiting for someone curious enough to notice. So the next time you see a number on a receipt, a license plate, or yes, even a taxi, think of Ramanujan. Ask yourself, what secrets might this number hold? Maybe none, maybe it's just a number, but maybe, just maybe, it's hiding something beautiful. And that's the magic of Ramanujan. He didn't just do mathematics, he lived it, he breathed it, he dreamed it. Even in his weakest moments, he could turn something dull into something eternal. 1729, a taxi number, a hospital visit, a spark of brilliance, and a reminder that sometimes the smallest observations can become the biggest legends. Cambridge University. The ancient towers, the quiet courtyards, the endless libraries full of wisdom. For most mathematicians, arriving there would feel like entering paradise. For Ramanujan, it was complicated. On one hand, he was finally in a place where people could understand his work. For the first time in his life, he wasn't completely alone with his notebooks. He had Hardy, Littlewood, and other professors who could follow at least some of his results. His theorems were being published. His reputation was growing. He was at last being recognized as the genius he truly was. On the other hand, life in Cambridge was a daily battle. The food was strange, the climate was brutal, the culture was alien, and Ramanujan, shy and soft-spoken, struggled to find his footing. Let's start with the food. Ramanujan was a strict vegetarian. Back in India that wasn't hard. Fresh vegetables, rice, lentils, spices, plenty to eat. In England during wartime, not so much. Britain was under rationing. Meat-heavy meals dominated the tables. Vegetables were scarce. And even when he found them, they weren't the vegetables he knew. Imagine going from fiery South Indian curry to boiled cabbage and bread. That's like replacing a symphony with someone banging on a single drum. There are stories of Ramanujan trying to cook for himself, buying milk and simple ingredients, making do with whatever he could. But he often went hungry. His health, already fragile, grew worse. Hardy worried about him constantly. Friends tried to help, but the truth was, Cambridge just wasn't built for someone like Ramanujan. Then there was the weather. England is cold, damp, grey. For a man raised in the heat of Tamil Nadu, the endless drizzle was torture. He shivered in his rooms, wrapped in blankets, drinking tea, his body weakening. His letters home often mentioned his struggles. He missed the warmth. He missed the sun. He missed his family. And yet, in the middle of all this discomfort, his mind blazed brighter than ever. The theorems poured out. Hardy described working with him as a constant astonishment. Every day seemed to bring some new revelation. Infinite series, modular forms, partitions, elliptic functions. Ramanujan touched them all. One of his triumphs at Cambridge was his election to the Royal Society in 1918. Think about that. A poor, self-taught Indian clerk who had failed out of college was now being honoured as a Fellow of the Royal Society, one of the highest distinctions in science. He was also elected a Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, the very institution that had once seemed an unreachable dream. It was recognition not just of his genius, but of his extraordinary journey. But even as his fame grew, his struggles never stopped. He was often isolated. His accent, his clothes, his quiet demeanour set him apart from the Cambridge crowd. Students and professors were curious, even admiring, but he remained a stranger in their world. Hardy tried to support him, but Hardy himself was socially awkward, more comfortable with equations than emotions. Their friendship was deep, but it couldn't erase the loneliness. And then there was his health. Tuberculosis, poor nutrition, and the stress of wartime England took their toll. He was hospitalised more than once. Doctors were often baffled by his condition, prescribing treatments that sometimes did more harm than good. Hardy visited him faithfully, bringing comfort, but it was clear Ramanujan was fighting a losing battle with his body. Still, he never stopped working. Even in the hospital he scribbled formulas. Visitors would find pages scattered around his bed, filled with new results. It was as if he knew his time was short and was racing to capture as much as possible before the clock ran out. Here's the paradox. His life at Cambridge was both the peak of his career and the hardest period he ever endured. On the one hand, he reached the heights of recognition. On the other, he endured constant physical suffering. Triumph and struggle, hand in hand. There's also a certain comedy in imagining Ramanujan at Cambridge. Picture him in a formal dinner hall, surrounded by professors in gowns, everyone eating roast beef and pudding. And there's Ramanujan at the end of the table, with a plate of bread and milk, politely refusing everything else, probably wondering what on earth he was doing there. The clash of worlds was so complete it's almost absurd. Yet, despite the hardships, Cambridge gave him what he had longed for all his life: validation. Back in India, he had been dismissed, doubted, ignored. In England, he was celebrated as a genius. Hardy said later that Ramanujan was the most remarkable mathematician he had ever known. And Hardy was not a man prone to exaggeration. It's moving to think about. A boy who had grown up barefoot in a small town, scribbling in notebooks no one understood, now stood among the greatest minds of the age, his work shaping the future of mathematics. That journey alone is enough to make your head spin. But recognition doesn't cure loneliness. Fame doesn't fix hunger, and genius doesn't protect you from illness. For Ramanujan, Cambridge was a place of both triumph and tragedy. It gave him the platform to share his brilliance, but it also drained his health. Still, when we look back, we can see the extraordinary legacy he built in those years. Papers that remain classics, theorems that open new worlds, formulas that still inspire awe. His time at Cambridge may have been short and painful, but it burned with a brilliance that has never dimmed. So when we talk about Ramanujan at Cambridge, let's remember both sides. The struggles, the cold, the hunger, the illness, the isolation, and the triumphs, the recognition, the discoveries, the lasting legacy. Together, they paint the picture of a man who, against all odds, carved his place in history. It was life at its hardest. It was life at its most glorious. For Ramanujan, Cambridge was both the test and the triumph of his genius. By the time Ramanujan had settled into life at Cambridge, one truth was becoming painfully clear. His body simply wasn't built for England. The cold, damp climate gnawed at him. The rationed food never sat right in his stomach, and his health, fragile since childhood, began to crumble. Tuberculosis was the big enemy. In early 20th century England, TB was a terrifying diagnosis. There were no antibiotics, no reliable cures. Rest and diet were the only weapons doctors had. But rest was impossible for a man who lived on numbers. And diet? Well, let's just say England in wartime wasn't famous for its vegetarian cuisine. Imagine going from tamarind rice and spicy sambar back home to boiled potatoes and overcooked cabbage. Ramanujan tried to maintain his strict vegetarian habits, but options were bleak. He often survived on little more than bread, milk, and the occasional fruit. Hardy later joked that Ramanujan ate like a bird, but the truth was, he was malnourished, and his body grew weaker by the month. The weather didn't help. Endless rain, grey skies, the kind of damp cold that seeps into your bones. For someone raised in the warmth of Tamil Nadu, it was torture. Letters he sent home complained of the chill and the loneliness. He wrapped himself in blankets, shivered by the fire, and kept scribbling formulas anyway. And here's the heartbreaking part. Even as his body failed, his mind soared. The less energy he had for daily life, the more energy he seemed to pour into mathematics. Hospital stays didn't stop him. Visitors would find pages scattered around his bed, filled with equations. Nurses probably shook their heads, wondering what kind of patient spends his recovery writing modular identities. But for Ramanujan, mathematics wasn't work. It was survival. One famous moment captures this perfectly. Hardy came to visit him in the hospital. To make small talk, Hardy said his taxi number had been 1729, which seemed boring. Ramanujan immediately replied that 1729 was in fact fascinating, the smallest number expressible as the sum of two cubes in two distinct ways. Even at death's door he could summon beauty from what looked dull. His body was frail, but his brilliance was unstoppable. Of course, doctors tried their best, but medicine at the time was a guessing game. Some thought he had TB. Others suspected severe vitamin deficiency. Some prescribed strange diets or tonics. Nothing seemed to help for long. He would improve briefly, then decline again. It was a cruel cycle. Hardy worried constantly. He once admitted that he felt guilty for bringing Ramanujan to England, where the cold and the food might have accelerated his decline. But without Cambridge, the world might never have seen his genius. It's one of those tragic ironies. The place that gave Ramanujan recognition also gave him misery. Still, Ramanujan pressed on. In 1918, at the height of his illness, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, the first Indian mathematician to receive that honour. Imagine the scene. A man too weak to leave his bed being welcomed into one of the oldest scientific institutions in the world. Triumph and tragedy, side by side. What's astonishing is that some of his most mysterious results came from this period of illness. He wrote down formulas that baffled mathematicians for decades, work on modular forms and mock theta functions. At the time, nobody fully understood them. They sat quietly in his notebooks until the 20th century, when modern mathematicians rediscovered their importance. Today, those results connect to string theory and black hole physics. In other words, even as his body collapsed, his mind was peering into the mathematics of the future. There's a dark humour in all this. British doctors would scold him to rest. Friends would beg him to stop working so hard. And Ramanujan probably nodded politely, then went right back to scribbling formulas under the covers. He couldn't help himself. Numbers were his oxygen. Asking him to stop was like asking him to stop breathing. But his suffering was real. He was often in pain, often weak, often lonely. Cambridge could be a cold place in more ways than one. Hardy and a few others visited. But Ramanujan missed his family, his culture, his temple routines. His letters home reveal not just a longing for warmth and food, but for belonging, for a sense of home. And yet, despite all this, he never lost his humility. He still credited his discoveries to the goddess Namagiri. He never claimed glory for himself, even in illness, even in triumph. He saw himself as just the instrument. The mathematics he believed came from elsewhere. That's what makes this chapter of his life so powerful. Most of us would crumble under the weight of poverty, exile, illness, and war. Ramanujan turned that suffering into creativity. His body weakened, but his mathematics grew stronger. His pain became part of his legacy. So when we talk about a fragile health and a brilliant mind, it's not just a poetic phrase. It was his daily reality. Frailty and genius bound together in the same person. A man too weak to climb stairs, but strong enough to climb mountains of thought. And maybe that's why his story resonates so much. It's not just about brilliance, it's about resilience. About a man who against every obstacle kept writing, kept dreaming, kept believing. His health betrayed him. His environment failed him. But his mind, his passion, never abandoned him. By 1919, it was clear that Cambridge was killing Ramanujan as much as it was honouring him. The cold, the food, the loneliness, the endless grey skies, all of it wore him down. His body was giving out. The doctors weren't helping. Even Hardy, who admired him more than anyone, admitted that the environment was crushing him. So Ramanujan made the decision. He would go home, back to India, back to warmth, back to familiar food, back to the land where the goddess Namagiri first whispered numbers in his dreams. It must have been a bittersweet journey. On the one hand, he was finally leaving behind the bleak hospitals and the dreary weather. On the other hand, he was leaving Cambridge, the place where his genius had finally been recognised. He was sailing away from Hardy, his friend and collaborator, unsure if he'd ever see him again. The voyage itself couldn't have been easy. Travel in 1919 was slow and exhausting, especially for a man already frail with tuberculosis. He boarded the ship, wrapped in blankets, notebooks in hand, always notebooks. Even while sick, even while travelling, he couldn't stop scribbling. His fellow passengers probably thought he was eccentric, but in reality, history was being written in those pages. When he arrived back in India, there must have been joy, family, friends, the warmth of the sun on his skin, the taste of real food again. For the first time in years, he could eat tamarind rice and lentils instead of boiled potatoes. That alone must have felt like medicine. But the joy was shadowed by the truth. His health was beyond saving. The disease had taken too much. He was just 32, but his body was worn out. Still, he refused to surrender. In his final year, he worked furiously, filling pages with formulas that baffled even Hardy. One of the most mysterious things he left behind was his work on what he called mock theta functions. These strange mathematical creatures seemed half-formed, like glimpses of something bigger. At the time, nobody understood them. Hardy himself admitted he was baffled. It wasn't until the late 20th century, decades after Ramanujan's death, that mathematicians realized how deep they were. Today, mock theta functions connect to areas of physics like string theory and black hole entropy. In other words, Ramanujan's final notebooks contained visions of mathematics that wouldn't fully exist until nearly a century later. Think about that. A man on his deathbed in 1920 was writing down mathematics that physicists in the 1990s and 2000s would use to describe the universe. That's not just genius. That's prophecy. But let's not make this too solemn. There's a strange beauty in imagining him back in India, lying on a cot, weak but smiling, scribbling equations between sips of buttermilk, friends visiting, shaking their heads saying, "You should rest," and Ramanujan probably replying gently, "I am resting. This is rest for me." For him, numbers weren't work. They were peace. It's tempting to wonder what might have happened if he had lived longer. What more could he have discovered? What else lay hidden in that extraordinary mind? But history doesn't give us those answers. What we do know is that even in his last year, when most people would have put down their pens, Ramanujan produced some of his most mysterious and important work. In April 1920, at just 32 years old, Ramanujan passed away. His wife Janaki Ammal was by his side. His family and friends mourned him. Hardy, back in England, was devastated. He later wrote that his collaboration with Ramanujan was the most important experience of his life, and for the mathematical world, the loss was immense. But here's the thing. Ramanujan didn't really leave empty-handed. He left behind notebooks filled with thousands of results, some proved, some unproved, some still waiting to be understood. His death ended his life, but it didn't end his work. In a way, he never really left. There's something both tragic and inspiring in this ending. Tragic because a mind like his only got 32 years. Inspiring because those 32 years were enough to leave a legacy that still shapes mathematics today. And maybe, just maybe, returning to India gave him peace. He died not in a grey hospital but in the warmth of his homeland, surrounded by the sounds and smells of the place that had shaped him. In his final letters he still spoke of the goddess guiding him. Even at the end, his faith never wavered. For him, numbers were still divine. His illness could take his body, but not his dreams. So the story of Ramanujan's return is both a homecoming and a farewell, a return to where it all began, and the closing of a chapter too brief but endlessly rich. When Ramanujan passed away in 1920, he left behind something more precious than gold. Not money, not property, but notebooks. Thousands of pages crammed with results, some polished, many rough, most without proofs. These notebooks were like time capsules, filled with ideas decades ahead of their time. But here's the twist. Not all of them were immediately understood. In fact, some of them weren't even found. For years, mathematicians studied the three main notebooks Ramanujan had kept during his early years in India. Hardy and others combed through them, extracting treasures, publishing papers, building theories. But there was more, much more. In his final year, bedridden in India, Ramanujan filled additional pages with his strange visionary mathematics, especially his mysterious Mach theta functions. These papers didn't go straight into archives. Instead, they drifted through history like lost treasure maps. Here's where it gets cinematic. After his death, some of his unpublished work was sent back to England. They ended up at Trinity College, Cambridge, where Hardy had taught. And then they sat, forgotten, gathering dust on library shelves. Generations of students walked past them, not realizing they were sitting inches away from some of the greatest mathematics of the 20th century. Fast forward to 1976, nearly 56 years after Ramanujan's death. An American mathematician named George Andrews was doing research at Trinity College. He was digging through boxes, flipping through old manuscripts, and then, jackpot. He stumbled upon a pile of papers labelled simply Ramanujan's Lost Notebooks. Imagine that moment. You're browsing dusty files, probably expecting dull administrative records, and suddenly you're holding pages filled with Ramanujan's handwriting. Pages no one had seriously studied in half a century. It was like discovering a lost symphony of Mozart or a hidden painting by Da Vinci. Except instead of notes or brushstrokes, it was formulas, endless, dazzling formulas. Andrews realized instantly what he had found. He called it the discovery of a lifetime. The math community exploded with excitement. Suddenly, Ramanujan was alive again, speaking across decades through his scribbles. The lost notebooks weren't neat or orderly. They were filled with results scribbled quickly, many without explanation. Some looked like nonsense at first glance, but as mathematicians dug in, they realized these weren't random. They were brilliant. They contained hundreds of results nobody had seen before. Among them were expansions of his work on Mach theta functions, strange, half-understood objects that puzzled Hardy back in 1920. For decades, nobody knew what to make of them. They seemed incomplete, like hints of a deeper theory. But modern mathematics, especially areas connected to string theory and quantum physics, suddenly found uses for them. Ramanujan's deathbed scribbles had turned out to be prophecies of the future. Think about that. A dying man in India, writing formulas on scraps of paper, produced mathematics that wouldn't be fully appreciated until the late 20th and even 21st centuries. That's not just genius. That's a kind of immortality. And here's the funny part. Hardy once said he considered himself lucky to have collaborated with Ramanujan, but that Ramanujan's notebooks were often a nightmare. Too many results, not enough proofs. Imagine Hardy's ghost watching Andrews in 1976, pulling out yet another pile of results. Somewhere in the afterlife, Hardy probably groaned, "Not more notebooks." The rediscovery of the lost notebooks sparked an international effort. Mathematicians around the world began studying them, proving the results, connecting them to modern theories. Some of the work linked to modular forms, some connected to combinatorics, some, astonishingly, tied into black hole physics. It was as if Ramanujan had been peering into areas of science that didn't even exist in his lifetime. Even today, researchers are still working through these notebooks. They remain a treasure chest that hasn't been fully opened. Every few years, someone proves a new result from them, or finds a surprising application. Ramanujan is still publishing, a century after his death. There's a poetic justice to this. For much of his life, he was ignored, dismissed, treated as an outsider. His notebooks were misunderstood, undervalued. But time has vindicated him. The world eventually caught up, and there's something wonderfully romantic about the phrase "lost notebooks." It makes him sound like an adventurer, a mathematician Indiana Jones. Instead of ancient temples, his treasures were scribbled pages. Instead of golden idols, his discoveries were formulas. And instead of being lost in the jungle, they were sitting quietly on a library shelf the whole time. The story of the lost notebooks also reminds us how fragile knowledge can be. A misfiled folder, a forgotten box, and the world almost lost some of the greatest mathematics ever written. How many other treasures might be sitting in dusty archives, waiting for the right person to stumble upon them? But with Ramanujan, luck and persistence worked together. Andrews found the papers, mathematicians studied them, and now they form one of the most exciting parts of his legacy. So the lost notebooks weren't just rediscovered mathematics. They were proof that Ramanujan's genius hadn't faded with his death. It was still alive, still shaping the future, still astonishing people decades later. The boy from Kumbakonam, the clerk from Madras, the sickly man in Cambridge. His story didn't end in 1920. His lost notebooks made sure of that. When a mathematician dies, their work often fades quietly into history. A few theorems here, a formula there, maybe a footnote in a textbook. But with Ramanujan, the opposite happened. His influence didn't shrink with time. It grew. It's still growing. His legacy is like a ripple that turned into a tidal wave. So what exactly did he leave behind? The short answer, a mountain of mathematics. The long answer, a mountain of mathematics that somehow keeps getting taller. Start with number theory, the study of integers and their hidden patterns. Ramanujan's work on partitions, congruences, and modular forms revolutionized the field. Those ideas didn't stop in the 1920s. They flowed into modern cryptography, the math behind online security. Every time you log into your bank account or send a private message, there's a little bit of Ramanujan whispering in the background. Then there are his mock theta functions. When he wrote them down on his deathbed, Hardy didn't understand them. Nobody did. For decades, they sat like unsolved riddles. But in the late 20th century, mathematicians realized they connected to areas like string theory and the mathematics of black holes. Yes, black holes, those cosmic monsters that bend space and swallow light. Physicists discovered that counting the quantum states of a black hole required the very functions Ramanujan had scribbled in 1920. He was, in a sense, doing 21st century physics before physics itself had caught up. That SIP's not just impressive, that SIP's spooky. His formulas for pi are another shining piece of the legacy. Remember those lightning-fast series? Computers now use them to calculate billions, even trillions of digits of pi. The irony is delicious. Ramanujan, who worked with little more than a pencil and scraps of paper, gave the digital age one of its most powerful tools. It's like leaving a time machine hidden in your backyard for future generations to discover. But his legacy isn't just technical, it's also human. His story has inspired countless people far outside the world of mathematics. A boy from a poor town in India, with no formal training, who dreamed numbers and changed the world. That story has been told in books, plays, and films. The 2015 movie The Man Who Knew Infinity introduced him to a new generation. His face even appeared on postage stamps and coins in India. He became not just a mathematician, but a symbol. A symbol of what? Of resilience, of genius blooming in unlikely places, of the idea that brilliance doesn't require privilege or perfect conditions. Sometimes it just takes passion, persistence, and a notebook. Hardy once ranked mathematicians on a scale of brilliance. He put himself around 25, Littlewood around 30, and David Hilbert, one of the greatest of all time, near 80. Ramanujan, he said, was a 100. That's how highly Hardy thought of him. And Hardy was not known for being generous with praise. What makes his legacy even richer is how unfinished it feels. His notebooks are still being studied. Mathematicians are still proving theorems he left behind, still unpacking the hints and fragments he scribbled. It's like he dropped breadcrumbs that lead into forests we're still exploring. Every few years another paper comes out with a headline like, "New breakthrough based on Ramanujan's notes." He's still collaborating with us, a century after his death. And his impact isn't limited to pure math. His ideas connect to computer science, physics, and even engineering. Modular forms, partitions, infinite series. They weave through disciplines in ways Ramanujan himself could never have imagined. He was working with pure intuition, but the world keeps finding applications. There's something almost poetic about that. Hardy believed math was beautiful precisely because it was useless, pure, abstract, untouched by messy applications. Ramanujan, guided by dreams, wrote formulas without worrying where they might be used, and now those useless formulas are helping us understand the fabric of the universe. Sometimes the universe has a wicked sense of humor. But beyond all the technical achievements, maybe the greatest part of his legacy is inspiration. For students who feel out of place in the rigid structures of school, for dreamers who doodle in notebooks no one else understands, for anyone who's ever felt that spark of obsession and wondered if it's enough, Ramanujan proves it can be. He showed that genius doesn't have to follow the rules, that brilliance can come from intuition, from faith, from obsession, from places the world least expects. He was an outsider who changed the inside, and in doing so he reminded us that mathematics isn't just about logic, it's also about imagination. So when we talk about Ramanujan's legacy, we're not just talking about theorems and functions. We're talking about a man who stretched the boundaries of what mathematics could be. A man whose ideas echo in black holes, computer codes, and infinite digits of pi. A man whose life story still gives hope to dreamers everywhere. Not bad for someone who failed his college exams. And so we come to the end of Ramanujan's story, a story that began in a small town in South India, with a boy scribbling in notebooks no one could understand, a story that crossed oceans, baffled professors, and left behind formulas that still dazzle us today. Ramanujan was not like other mathematicians. He didn't think of math as a career. He didn't think of it as a subject in school. For him, numbers were alive. They whispered, they danced, they revealed themselves in dreams. Where most of us see numbers as cold symbols on a page, he saw them as companions, friends with secrets, messages from the divine. That's what makes him so fascinating. Mathematics is often painted as the driest subject. Endless rules, endless proofs, endless boredom. But Ramanujan turned it into something mystical, something poetic, something almost magical. Think of Hardy, his great collaborator. Hardy loved mathematics too, but in a different way. To Hardy, math was beauty through rigor, elegance through proof. To Ramanujan, Math was beauty through revelation, through intuition. Together they balanced each other, the skeptic and the dreamer, the atheist and the mystic, the proof seeker and the vision bearer. Their collaboration showed us that mathematics can live in two worlds at once, the logical and the mysterious. And yet, Ramanujan's life was short, only 32 years, shorter than most of us get. But in those years, he filled thousands of pages with results that would take generations to unpack. Some of his discoveries still guide modern science. Others remain puzzles, teasing mathematicians to this day. His flame burned briefly, but it burned brighter than almost any other. So, what is his legacy? It's not just the formulas, though those are remarkable. It's the reminder that human creativity is bigger than the systems we build. Ramanujan didn't fit into the school system. He didn't follow the rules of academia. He didn't write polished papers full of careful proofs. And yet he changed mathematics forever. He proved that genius can thrive even when the world says no. And maybe that's why his story resonates far beyond math. You don't have to care about partitions or mock theta functions to feel inspired by him. His life is about persistence, about following obsession, about trusting that spark inside you, even when no one else understands it. There's also something deeply comforting about the way he described his own genius. He never bragged. He never called himself brilliant. He always said the credit belonged to the goddess Namagiri. Whether you believe in goddesses or not, there's humility in that. He saw himself as a vessel, not the source. Maybe that's part of why his mathematics feels so otherworldly, because even he treated it as something beyond himself. And of course, there's the humour, the little moments that make him human. The vegetarian struggling with English food, the quiet man in hospital beds, still calculating, the instant response to Hardy about the taxi number 1729. Those touches remind us he wasn't just a mystical genius. He was also a person, shy, modest, sometimes lonely, sometimes amused, always scribbling. If you close your eyes, you can almost picture him, a thin figure in a simple room bent over a notebook, candlelight flickering, pen scratching. Outside, the world moves on with its wars, its politics, its noise. Inside, on that page, infinity is being tamed, numbers are being coaxed into new patterns, and the man writing them doesn't think of fame or history. He just thinks of the beauty in front of him. That's Ramanujan, the man who dreamed numbers. And perhaps that's the final lesson. Mathematics is not only logic, it's also imagination. It's not only about grinding proofs, it's also about daring to dream. Ramanujan's life reminds us that even the most abstract symbols can carry stories, mysteries, even a touch of the divine. So if you ever find yourself staring at numbers, frustrated or bored, remember Ramanujan. Remember that behind those digits there might be patterns waiting to be discovered. Remember that even in the most ordinary taxi number there can be hidden beauty. And if you're listening to this late at night, maybe already half asleep, let Ramanujan's story sink in. A boy who turned dreams into mathematics. A man who saw infinity in candlelight. A genius who never stopped scribbling, even when the world didn't understand him. His life was short, but his numbers are endless. They live on, whispering to anyone curious enough to listen. So rest now. Let the numbers drift past like stars in the night sky. And who knows, maybe tonight in your own dreams a number or two will visit you. Good night, from the man who dreamed numbers.